Most of you knew his dad and were probably influenced by him, but he is quite an artist in his own right. I mean artist in terms of painting, photography, filmmaking, and now as an author. There are few people who have influenced me as much as Dr. Francis Schaeffer, and it was his book, The God Who Is There, that formulated much of my early ministry's worldview. And just recently, in Dallas, Texas, at the Christian Booksellers Convention, I had the privilege for the first time in my life of meeting his mother riding an elevator and could tell her how much she meant to me. But now I have the privilege of talking to the son of Dr. Francis Schaeffer, a man who has set out on his own some years ago to make his mark in the world, and he certainly has, though he's done it in quite a different way than his dad did it. He is Frank Schaeffer. He is the guy who has stirred things up in the past with books like Addicted to Mediocrity, but now he's written his first novel after having been involved in movies, and maybe you've seen his latest film, Baby on Board, with Judge Reinhold. Frank Schaeffer joins me today, and the book is called Portofino, and it is published by Macmillan. I have read the book. It's very fascinating. Being a first-time novelist myself, I have a lot of empathy for anybody who tries a new venture like this. Let's give you a quick summary. Portofino is the story of a young man named Calvin. He's the youthful protagonist who recounts his Mediterranean vacation while growing up in a very dysfunctional Christian family, American Presbyterian missionaries in Switzerland. And he's a little embarrassed by his parents' fighting and their insensitivity and their sort of iconoclastic ways. Well, Calvin tries to escape these legalistic trappings and along the way gets himself in an awful lot of trouble. Frank Schaeffer says, there's no direct connection between him and the family he grew up in. But Frank, in the novel Portofino, I've got to say, the analogous aspects of it ring very clearly to me of someone who has been on a distinct spiritual pilgrimage from legalism to what some might call liberalism. So tell me, what are the connections with real life and what kind of spiritual pilgrimage is being described?
Well, Bob, as you know, fact and fiction are hard to separate. When you write a book, you draw on your own experiences in terms of the places you set the book, the kind of people that you populate the pages with. But anyone who reads Portofino and reads about the somewhat dysfunctional, rather funny mother and father there, and who knew Francis Schaeffer personally or knows my mother, will know that obviously the Becker family, the folks in Portofino, are not the same as Francis and Edith Schaeffer. On the other hand, I set Portofino in a part of the world I know well. We really did take vacations in Italy. Switzerland, where my parents were working at the Brief Fellowship, was only a 4.5-hour train ride from Portofino. And I peopled it with the kind of people I've certainly known in the Christian world. And there are some personal anecdotal episodes in the book. I can remember back to when I was 13, 14, and I first noticed that little girls I had known when I was growing up were no longer little girls. And I can remember that my parents, like all other families, had some problems, not the same kind of problems that I talk about in Portofino, but we had things to work through like everybody does. And, above all, I can remember growing up as a kid in a Christian family, thinking that it was normal to worry about theological things and whether one was saved or not and all this kind of thing, and finding out that out in a larger world there were a lot of people from more secular backgrounds who, didn't get up every morning wondering if they were one of the elect or go to bed at night wondering if Jesus was going to come back, but lived somewhat less exercised and maybe less panic-ridden lives. So, yeah, there's a piece of me in there, but no, the Becker family is not the Schaeffer family.
All right, now that we've got that resolved, I got into a lot of trouble with my novel Dead Air, which was written as a work of fiction on the subject of satanic ritual abuse, and my goodness, because I dared to describe in mild detail some of the evil ceremonialism that I and therapists have encountered, people went so far as to call my book Christian pornography, which was rather a ludicrous accusation, but they did it. If I got in trouble, can I tell you, Frank, you're in for big-time trouble with this book. I mean, you tweak your nose at a lot of sacred cows. You talk about sex, body parts. You deal with crisis of faith, infidelity. I mean, you really run the gamut in here. Macmillan has published it. You're not really expecting wide acceptance of this in the mainstream evangelical community, are you?
Well, this may be have been somewhat your experience too, Bob. I don't know, but you tell me if this has ever occurred to you. You know, I meet a lot of people in the evangelical world, the mainstream as you put it, who will say things like this after they hear me speak or they read a book like Portofino or even some of my previous works. Hey, I love your book, but you're going to be in all sorts of trouble with other people. The fact of the matter is, I think there are a lot of Christians who worry a lot of the time about what other people will think of what they do or what they read or the movies they see. They keep assuming that there's some kind of magisterium of Christian thought. Maybe it's in Wheaton or someplace that is keeping track of all this. But when you get down to an individual level, I meet a lot of Christians who are evangelicals, some who even would describe themselves as fundamentalists, who not only are very open to the idea that we as Christians have problems like everybody else, but also share the view that it's about time that we try to tell a little more of the truth about the human condition in Christian families and other things, rather than just being, you know, propagandists for Christianity and people who are Christians. So I think you have to kind of give two answers to that question. One, the kind of backward-looking, almost paranoia some Christians seem to suffer from in wondering what other people will always think of what they say or do. And then the other, the fact that there are many, many individuals out there, I dare say tens of thousands of them, who really are less exercised and less uptight, if you like, about what they read and what they see in terms of what other people will think of them. And if they have any worries at all, it's really just on behalf of others, but they themselves are very open to things, and I think that you can see that in the fact that there are many Christians, for instance, who enjoy a lot of good movies, like Babette's Feast, or like Cinema Paradiso, or My Life as a Dog, or movies like Blade Runner, kind of apocalyptic, futuristic stories.
But can I tell there's a big difference between Paradiso and My Life as a Dog.
Yeah.
I mean, I was flipping on television the other night in TNT, and
right.
I happened to see My Life as a Dog. I'd seen it one time before. There's a big difference between that and Babette. What are you really suggesting here? Are you suggesting there are no, and we'll get into this more in a moment, but are you suggesting there really are no moral boundaries of behavioralism within the Christian community?
No, not at all, but I think we've had a problem in the Christian community that comes out of a kind of a 19th century pietistic fundamentalism that really is not essentially Christian in terms of the history of the whole church. You know, the fact of the matter is, if you look at the kind of people who have been writers in the past who were very definitely Christian in their worldview, whether it was people like Shakespeare or Chaucer or others, or Dickens more recently in the more modern era, or even today, people like Flannery O'Connor or Walker Percy for the 20th century, or Malcolm Muggeridge or others, you know, we haven't always had this kind of knee-jerk response of wanting to make everything into this pablum that we call quote-unquote family entertainment. I think it's a question of what's appropriate. Now, to me, Portofino is a story that's written to adults. It's about a child, but it's certainly not a children's book, and it's not being marketed as such. I find no embarrassment about talking about the fact that little boys, of which I was one not too many years ago, even though I'm 40 now, discover their sexuality, and they have a first crush on somebody and maybe a first kiss. I don't think there's anything in Portofino that is that terribly graphic or embarrassing to what I would call perfectly decent sensibilities, but I do think it goes a little further than you're going to find some books do. But I will say this, I would find it curious if people who have any kind of conception of what Christian literature has been in the past, just take Charles Dickens again with all his graphic descriptions of grinding poverty and kind of the bestial existence of people that he wanted to show their condition, or for that matter, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in which you have all kinds of violence and these sort of things to show the evils of slavery, are going to be shocked by my mildly funny stories in which the most that can be said is that they talk about a little boy's first sexual yearnings, and really, if you look at the context of the book, I don't see how you could deal with a little boy's coming-of-age story in a Christian family or anywhere else and tell the truth about it without going into at least some of this to the degree I do, albeit in a light-handed and, I hope, amusing way, because, after all, Portofino is a work of humor.
All right, it's a story of an optimistic fundamentalist missionary family trying to convert Roman Catholics in Switzerland. That's a big task. The mother and father are basically out to convert everybody they want to meet, and the Beckers bicker. And along the line, little Calvin has his first sip of alcohol, his first kiss, and forbid the thought he visits a Roman Catholic church. There are, however, in the book, and it's as you obviously know that you can do in a fictional setting, you can work in a lot of philosophical questions to be raised. And one of the quotes which interested me, you said that the mother had a parallel universe of phrases that turned almost every imaginable thing into either a moral lesson or defanged its passion and left it as harmless as a faded Victorian lavender-scented postcard. It's great writing, Frank. And basically, what you're suggesting is that too many people in the fundamentalist and evangelical community essentially take anything that may embarrass them, may be uncomfortable for them, and they just denude it. They castrate it, so to speak. They make it into something innocuous. Why must we feel in the religious community that we must do this? Is it because the world is too threatening to us?
I think it's something of that. Yeah, I think it's in that direction. You know, the world is a pretty rough place these days in many areas, and I think, you know, the tendency is to pull in one's horns and simply build the wall a little higher and live within a kind of pietistic ghetto mentality, if not an actual ghetto, and try to pretend that there's nothing bad out there or ugly or even real. You know, I'm reminded by a lot of Christian writing these days and ideas in so-called entertainment, really of something a lot closer to Disney's Epcot Center than to the tradition of historic involvement in the arts. After all, you know, we have some pretty hefty names back there, like Rembrandt and Bach and Michelangelo and Shakespeare and Chaucer and Milton and so forth. We usually have not been, when I say we, I mean Christians in the largest sense of the word through history, have not been identified with kind of generic pablum entertainment that offends no one, says nothing, and simply is sort of one more 12-step Al-Anon-style project to better feeling about something or other, or codependency, or you name it. You know, normally we've been the guys out on the cutting edge asking the tough questions. We've been the people writing the novels that shake things up. You know, people say that it was Charles Dickens' novels that really turned Victorian England on its head and made them aware of poverty for the first time because of all his graphic descriptions of grinding and poor life. The same thing with Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, this too is part of our inheritance. So when exactly, to be a Christian artist, you had to start kind of doing Disney, Epcot Center, family, generic kind of defanged entertainment, I don't know. And whether it was to do with the kind of revivalist mentality that saw everything in terms of winning souls for Christ, nothing else was important, whether it was to do with the reaction against the kind of modernism we see around us today, I'm not sure. But the fact of the matter is, all I can tell you, and this would be open to people debating, of course, but if you look at the history of Christian involvement in the arts through the many hundreds of years of active involvement by Christians in the arts, you just don't see what is typical of today, and that is this kind of hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil, hide your eyes, ears, and mouth, and really go underground into our kind of pietistic ghetto. That's just not been what the Christian witness has been. So, you know, there may be people out there who are surprised that somebody who wrote a book like A Time for Anger or Addicted to Mediocrity, which were my books as well, would turn around and write a novel like Portofino. But anybody who read Addicted to Mediocrity and read my call for Christians' involvement in the arts and understood what I was talking about and read some of my critique of this kind of pablum mush that passes for Christian entertainment these days, certainly should not be surprised.
You have the mother in the book saying, when you're spiritually empty, you need to always fill up the empty hole only God can fill. And you fill it up with anything that will help you forget your spiritual emptiness. That's a common line that is used by Christians to sort of justify the fact that anything anyone else is doing that we disapprove of must be some kind of carnal pursuit that is less than spiritual and therefore less than preferable, and they are the worldly people. What has caused us, and you do deal with this in the novel, to develop this kind of we versus they mentality? We are the inside group. We have the correct behavior. We have the we have the politically correct viewpoint of life. Isn't that really what you're kind of getting at here? That we need to break through the boundaries of assuming this we versus they. They are the sinners. We are the Christians. They're the bad ones. We're the good ones. Yeah, very much so. You know, I think one of the most unfortunate things that I guess I try to point out a little bit in the novel, albeit again in a light and humorous way. But I think one of the two most unfortunate things in the Christian world of the 20th century is that, first of all, we have really taken on the mantle of Phariseeism in our age. You know, you read Christians railing against different things in the arts, sometimes with great justification. Or you read about us casting aspersions on people or judgments of everybody from the ACLU to, say, the homosexual lobby, all of which are true a lot of the time.
unfortunately, you don't read of our contributions to this society. So for every photograph we rail against, I wish those same Christian magazines would print a photo exhibit of winning photography of young Christians who are photographers. For every painting we exercise and basically try to say should not be in a museum or an exhibit or whatever, or getting funding from the government. I wish we were opening some art schools and encouraging people to paint.
Then why don't we? What is the bottom line of why it is so easy to criticize and so difficult to act? Why are we reactionary and not proactive in what we're doing to penetrate the darkness with light?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but one of them goes back to what you were saying about the mother in Portofino. You know, she has reduced her Christian witness to a set of tried and true platitudes, and this is really the stock and trade of fundamentalist pietism. It's taking the essential life out of the Christian faith, reaching out to people in love and forgiveness, not being as the Pharisee who raises his hands up and says, "I thank you, Lord, I am not as other men," and rather praying as the publican prayed for forgiveness and repentance. We've turned this around, and we reduce our faith to a series of nice, pious platitudes that work as long as they're not questioned most of the time, is the way I think of it. And the way we present ourselves to the world is really in a very negative light, preaching at the world or simply criticizing what they're doing. But we fail to do what Christ did, and that is share in the actual condition of the world. And if people try that, for instance, if a minister goes down to the corner bar, has a few beers with the local boys playing pool down there who actually really would need his help and need to hear the gospel, and becomes one of them and gets to a place where they trust him as a human being and will begin to tell him their troubles, his pietistic goody two-shoes congregation, of course, will immediately throw him out on his ear, because what they really want is a pastor who's a nice middle American, well-behaved person from their point of view. They don't want somebody who gets down there and gets dirty and gets slimed, as it were, by the world, the same way Christ did.
But Frank, excuse me, but you're asking for trouble here. I mean, not that you haven't asked for it in the past, and not that I'm not a person who asks for a lot of trouble and gets it myself. But let me tell you something. You're really kicking the jams over here. I mean, in this book, you are really flying in the face of the conventional wisdom of what now has become entrenched evangelicalism in America, and you're flying in the face of a powerful political and religious lobby in this country.
Well,
you really think you're going to get by with this?
Yeah, I don't know, but I think you make a good point, because you just said it in a way that I think sums it up, and that is, it is a powerful lobby, and the fact of the matter is, let's look at the Christianity we call Christianity and ask ourselves, is this just the American civil religion to help us get through the night, the kind of psychobabble that we like to stroke ourselves with to make us feel better? Or is this a real commitment to truth and let the chips fall where they may, including when we try to tell the truth about ourselves and our own failings and weaknesses? And, I have to agree with you. I think there's a big part of Christianity in this country that has a big vested interest in a status quo, seeing things go on as they are, not rocking the boat, not asking too many questions, because the fact of the matter is, I think like the mother in Portofino, a lot of what passes for Christianity today is simply a whole series of Pharisaical platitudes that are fine until we measure them against the content of people's characters. And the fact of the matter is, the little boy in Portofino, when he rebels and asks questions in a very gentle way, and when he starts going into this Roman Catholic Church and crossing himself with holy water, he's not reacting to the doctrines of Christianity to the degree he understands them. He is fundamentally rebelling against the hypocrisy of his parents, who basically talk a good game, live another life altogether, and even the theology that they present to him is so harsh and juridical and narrow and judgmental that given half a chance, just ordinary decent pagan sinners who are at least human beings and are kind to him, he votes with his feet. And you know what? He's not alone. Little Calvin Becker in My Story Portofino is simply the mirror image of tens of thousands of people who have voted with their feet and left Protestantism and the evangelical and fundamentalist fold in droves. And, we like to talk about all the people who are signing on for the ride and having born-again experiences, but let's also talk about the many people that you must meet, and like I've met, and I guess anybody who's out there at all has met, who have been so turned off by the kind of moralistic Christianity of our age that, they're ready basically to hang it up, and many of them have, and they too are out there. And maybe I'm writing Portofino for people who've just had a little bit too much of the pietism and the platitudes and the nice fundamentalist presentations without any love at its heart, and they're ready to see or at least read a funny, amusing novel that is somewhat at the expense of a kind of a Christianity that maybe should have been examined a long time ago.
Well, I think what you're
novels.
Yeah, I think what you're writing, Frank. I think you're writing a book that a lot of people who are going to be very amused at reading and will never admit they laughed at. A book that a lot of people will love reading and identify with, but will never want to admit that they identified with it. You use some interesting human life situations that deal with profound theological issues in this book. And there's one, and there's so much to cover. Just deal with this briefly. You got little Calvin sitting there with a salt shaker.
Right.
And there's rice in the salt shaker.
Right.
And what is just a common little experience, you make it into really a profound theological issue. The kid's with the salt shaker, and he's dealing with one of these cosmic issues of spiritual reality, but he isn't willing, when his father says, "What are you doing?" to face up to what he was really thinking about. I mean, he can't let go and let his family know. Just quickly recount how you deal with that.
Well, in the story, they're all sitting around at this little Italian hotel down on the Riviera, and of course, his father's a minister, and all he talks about is theology, and on vacation, the guy doesn't go swimming. He just sits there reading back issues of Christianity Today and whatever. The little kid lives in this theological atmosphere, so for him, theology is normal, and he's always being told about the sovereignty of God, and from the Calvinist position, man's lost all his free will, and there's no way to beat the sovereignty of God. There's no way to get ahead of it. Everything you do has been planned since the beginning of time in the Calvinistic, fatalistic kind of theology. By the way, that really is what Calvinism teaches.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no way to escape God's grace if you're going to be saved. Then you can get away from paying your annual visit to the dentist, and there's no way to be saved if you've been elected to be lost, even if you believe in Jesus. This is what he's been taught. It's all predestined. So he's sitting there playing with this little salt shaker, and he figures, well, look, if I shake it hard enough, maybe I can rearrange the grains of salt in here in a way that God can't keep account of. Maybe I can do something, one thing in my life that isn't predestined, foreordained before the beginning of time, like everything else is. So he starts shaking it around, playing with it, and then the salt spills on the table, and he throws some over his head inadvertently. And, his father wants to know what on earth he's doing, and, he finishes up by just looking at his dad saying, "God made me do it," before he even thinks of what he's saying. Well, we think, well, that's kind of a funny episode, but it was curious. A guy who had read my book last week said to me, I remember as a child worrying about a different kind of a thing. I was raised in a Pentecostal home in which every morning my parents would get up and tell us that Jesus was probably coming back that day. And when I'd get home from school, if my mother and dad weren't in the house, I'd run in a panic to the bathroom, flush the toilet, and see if all the water in the house had turned to blood. And if it still was running clear, I figured they were just out shopping, because it says in Revelation that when Christ comes back, the water's going to turn to blood. Now, we laugh, and it's funny, and
It's not funny. I used to turn on the faucet.
Yeah,
exactly. It's a real story. I used to turn on the faucet as a kid.
Exactly. So,
thinking that Jesus had come. I'd figure it out. I wasn't living the Christian life, raised in that kind of a Christian home. And I love my parents, and they were wonderful. But they happened to have that same type of an attitude. And if I did something bad as a kid, I'd turn on the faucet.
That's it. So here's the deal. We've got all these people raising Christian kids in Christian families, most of whom are great parents, love their children, and so forth. And I include myself in this. But, maybe sometimes through a funny book like Portofino about a kid from a kid's point of view, we can help to see a little bit the things we take for granted as part of a larger reality that we've come to. Our kid just sees the very narrowly defined things we say, and the fact of the matter is, we give our children some very odd ideas about God and about life and love and beauty and all the rest of it, both by what we say and our example. Portofino's, about a kid who's discovering that his parents' philosophy is not all that it's cracked up to be, and furthermore, their own lives have all kinds of trouble. And, the parents in Portofino would have done a lot better to level with their little boy. I hate to lecture my own characters that I've created, but they really would have done better to sit down with Calvin and level with him and tell him what their problems were and their own uncertainties and fears, rather than pretending they had all the answers all the time and being so harsh and correcting every time he strayed from the fold.
You get real specific in the book. Even though it's a work of fiction, you deal with some actual religious realities. And there's a situation in the book where there is a denominational split, how close to the truth this is. In the Presbyterian Church, which was the father's denomination of the boy in the book, and you said, Dad did not know if he could be faithful to the things of the Lord and work under the authority of men who, at their last conference on the inerrancy of Scripture, had actually allowed a paper to be read by a theological professor from Dallas Seminary who said he did not believe Christ would reign as king during the millennium and who believed that after the rapture, the end would come without the millennium. You have in the book the characters, the parents, straining over these very specific, complex issues related to theological special interest group, and you got this little kid sitting over there kind of shaking his head like, who cares? I'm just awakening to the reality of life. What is the message there? Is it just a simple message that denominational and theological special interest group ridden mentalities are stifling to the human spirit?
Well, I think that, and I also think that it's time in our day and age to face squarely the fact that when you have 23,000 denominations with 5 new ones being created a week, which, by the way, is the United Nations statistics on worldwide Protestant denominations for the year of 1990, 23,000 with 5 new ones a week, that, the message this sends to the world is not one of presenting a unified field of truth or any kind of a moral certainty or teaching. And I think what little Calvin Becker finds in his life is that, their denomination, the PCCC USA, they keep adding initials because even in his little short lifetime, they've split 2, 3, 4 times. And, the latest split is over the issue, the little piece you read out of the book. But, it's funny. They keep adding initials to try to show that they are pure. And, of course, this has always been the Protestant answer. This has been the answer, and that is just simply split, start your own church, go away, claim you're the only pure Christian left, try to find the moral high ground, then somebody in your group doesn't think you're pure enough, so they split. And again, we sort of take this for granted because it's part of recent American church history, but from the point of view of a child being raised in an atmosphere where, their parents are always talking about the latest church split, who's right, who's wrong, talk about Phariseeism, they grew up with the idea that probably their church is the only denomination that has any visible purity. Probably within that denomination there's only a handful of people who are as pure as they are. Probably nobody is a true spiritual kindred spirit along with their parents because they hear their parents all the time simply running down everybody around them is not quite up to the mark. Now you take this little boy and you put him in Portofino, Italy. You put him in this wonderful resort. The air is warm, the sun is bright. There's a nice little English girl on the beach who just wants to go snorkeling and catch octopus and look at the fish. And, you can steal a kiss on a little moonlight path some night. Well, you tell me which world you'd rather vote for. The PCCCC USA and their latest split over some obscure doctrine, or a good lunch of mortadella and Italian bread sitting under an awning looking out at the sparkling Mediterranean. Well, the fact of the matter is, if we're so determined to present Christianity as such a narrow, bloodless, fleshless, unreal, theological set of presuppositions, we better not be surprised when people metaphorically, vote for La Dolce Vita and the warm Italian sun. We'd do a lot better to do what the historic church has always done, and that is present Christianity as truth theologically, but also something to do with life and having babies and falling in love and having a good glass of wine and enjoying a painting and writing an opera. If that is involved in our Christian life too, then maybe the lordship of Christ over all of life is something more than a theological formula. If it's just to do with prayer meeting and church splits, then no wonder people vote with their feet. That's all I can say, and that's what Portofino's about.
This is the end of Side 1. Please turn the cassette over at this point for the continuation of the message on Side 2.
Speaking of love and babies and all that sort of thing, in the beginning of the book, you set us up real early in Portofino, indicating that the mother of the house is, quote, the head of the household in the department of sexual piety. She is really the protectress of these types of earthly realities. And then a little later, she finally gets around to discussing sex, but it's all about this little thing and this special egg. And then, horror of horrors, when she finally gets beyond this repression that she is foisting onto little Calvin here, she ends up in the arms of another man. Now, you're in trouble on this one, no question about it, in the evangelical community, because what you've taken is this woman who is the custodian of the proper sexual interpretation of life, having to deal with the own realities of her dysfunctional marriage, her emotional wasteland, reaching out to satisfaction and falling into the arms of what is this passing adulterous kind of liaison.
Yeah.
What is the message there? How are you going to avoid the religious community, and I understand you're not writing just for the religious community, but how are you going to avoid the evangelical community saying to you, what you have done is to present this Christian family as being sexually repressed and ultimately adulterous, and you have just broken down the standards by which we've tried to establish family values. You are in for a tough one on this. What's your response?
Well, my response is twofold. First of all, that this is a novel. Work of fiction is a human story, and unfortunately we live in a world where all kinds of things happen that are less than perfect.
But let me jump in on you just for a second here, Frank, because you can help me here, because I tried to say the same thing to people who criticized my novel Dead Air, and what I ran into is a curious mentality in the religious community. I kept saying, for crying out loud, whether it is factual or not, whether you agree with the theology or the philosophy or not, it is a novel. Do I, as a writer, a Christian writer, do not have the right and the freedom to express myself in a fictional context? And what I learned was there is a mentality in the Christian community that says, in a fictional context, it must meet our a priori standards of what we've determined is politically correct for the Christian viewpoint.
Well, at risk of sounding, I don't know how to put this. This is so obvious to me, I don't know where to begin. But I'll tell you where I'll start, and that would be with Scripture. Here's one I don't understand, and maybe you can help me. And I honestly mean I am bewildered by it. I cannot understand a group of people who say they live by the standard of Scripture, who look at the book and say it's God's word, inspired, every word is inerrant, and so forth. And then within the Scripture you have stories of David going out and cutting off the foreskins of 200 Philistines as an engagement present to Saul, literally. You have the story of David committing adultery, having somebody murdered to take their wife. You have even the Lord Jesus Christ becoming so discouraged that he weeps tears like blood drops in the Garden of Gethsemane and is fearful of his coming death. You have Peter denying Christ and being told to get behind me, Satan, 2 minutes after he's said that this will be the rock on which he builds his church. You've got one of the hand-picked disciples of Jesus Christ. I mean, he only picked 12 people, and 1/12 of his army, so to speak, turns out to be a traitor who hangs himself. We're told his guts split and his insides pour out on the ground. Then Shakespeare or Milton or Chaucer, or for that matter, in my little humble way, a Frank Schaeffer comes along and writes a book that, albeit in a mild and humorous way, because we're talking about Portofino, not Macbeth here, portrays a family that has real problems in a real world, and people start saying, how can this be a Christian context? Now, the weird thing to me is you can't have your cake and eat it too. If we say we have a historic faith that warts and all we tell the truth about, and we look at Scripture and we see everything from the Song of Solomon all the way through to all the infidelities and problems and Noah's daughters looking on his nakedness and the whole bit, then we turn around and all we want is Epcot Center and essentially Disney-esque rides where we have cartoon characters without genitals or feelings or hardship or problems or reality. I really can't see how we can connect all those dots up and say this represents a biblical worldview. Maybe it represents a Victorian pietistic worldview. Maybe it represents some kind of, pablum, I don't know what, Disney-esque worldview, but how can we say it's biblical? So to me the question is it a good book? Does it tell the truth? Does this portray the human condition or some part of it truthfully, or is this a pack of lies? The Christian families I know have problems. The people I've met who are Christians, many of them wonderful Christians, they've had problems in their marriages. I've been married 20-some years. It hasn't all been easy. I haven't been a perfect father. I've been too harsh with my kids at times. I've had big fights with my wife. Know anybody who hasn't? I don't. Well, you want me to write a book about a family and pretend this doesn't happen? Well, find me the family. Let me study them if we can only show perfect families in perfect conditions. I've never met any.
You deal with some of the most difficult issues in a very humorous context, and you talk about the things that are mainstream concerns, wine, cigarettes, tobacco, earthiness, and those awful Italian Catholics who cross themselves, wear immodest clothes, and therefore must obviously not be saved. And yet, little Calvin is drawn into that world. He's attracted by this world. He is repulsed by the asceticism of his parents. Is there not a danger here that some people may accuse you of giving people a license of exploration of carnality that's going to destroy their faith?
Well, let's put it again in the context. If that's what they take away from Portofino, I'd really be surprised, and I'd have to ask, well, what else have you been reading? Because it's a very mild and light book. But having said that, let's just look at this a second. You know, if Christianity really is as narrow and four white walls and a sermon, you know, which is what Presbyterianism has been called by some people, if that's really all it is, then, you know, maybe little Calvin's right. Maybe given the choice between that kind of Christianity, it would be better to just go off to Italy and be a pagan and wander around there on the beach with half-clad families, at least to enjoy their children and each other, than worship this kind of harsh juridical god that's more like Zeus out of Greek mythology, ready to strike everybody with a lightning bolt for having a sip of wine or taking a puff on a cigarette. So given the choice, maybe that's a world people should explore. The fact of the matter is, this writer, me, Frank Schaeffer, in this book and the other things I've written, what I say, and so forth, I don't think that is the choice. And that's not the choice I present with Calvin. And in the end, you know, you don't find this little boy totally abandoning his faith. He doesn't kick over the traces and murder his parents in their beds, much as some people may think they deserve it, some instances in this book. He, in a way, begins to discover another level, a kinder and gentler spirituality, a kind of a mystical approach to Christianity that is very foreign to his parents, and he begins to stumble into just by going into the local Roman Catholic Church and seeing a little old lady in there praying and lighting a candle and understanding that not everything is a 45-minute sermon of ranting and raving and Bible thumping, and maybe there is another quality to spirituality. And even though he's not an intellectual and he's a child, you know, through his experience in Italy, he at least begins to touch and see a better type of Christianity in terms of what he's known. After all, this kid's only been raised in one family. He hasn't had a chance to go around and see all the various Protestant denominations in the Eastern Orthodox Church and study theology and so forth. He has been presented with a harsh fundamentalism of the Calvinist bent, which is one of the tougher versions of Christianity the world has ever seen. This is the only choice he's had, and out of that he begins to discover a real spirituality. And you know, in terms of the character in my book, I would say more power to him, because given the alternatives, I think it's very reasonable.
Well, you talk about this kid stumbling in the Roman Catholic Church, and I have to ask you, you have not just stumbled into, you have willfully walked into the embrace of the Greek Orthodox Church. And is this then a kind of egoistic way of your expressing your own spiritual pilgrimage? And if so, how does the son of Calvinism end up in the Greek Orthodox Church?
Well, you know, how did Malcolm Muggeridge end up in the Roman Catholic Church? How come C.S. Lewis wound up as a high Anglican? You know,
well, the answer is very simple. They were apostate. They backslid. Well, the answer is pretty simple for some folks.
That's right. I guess that's the answer for some people. But from my point of view, my own spiritual journey from evangelical Christianity into evangelical orthodoxy is very simple, and that is that I wanted something more lasting, more historic, and more profound than the kind of make-it-up-as-you-go-along popularity opinion poll type of worship that I was finding increasingly in my evangelical circles. I wanted to be called to an altar, holiness, growth. I'd like to be given some spiritual tools, sacramental tools. I wanted some place where I could go and talk and confess and have someone that would give me more than just a little psychological advice in the form of a priest. And you know, what I began to discover in Orthodoxy was a world of spirituality and liturgic worship that I just wasn't aware of as someone growing up in a Protestant community. Does this mean that I think anybody outside of the Orthodox Church is not a Christian or unsaved, quote unquote? Absolutely not. Does this mean that I find that my spirituality is greater than other people's? Unfortunately not. It's still about as shabby and unfulfilled as it gets. But it does mean that for me, the spirituality available in Eastern Christianity has presented me with something that I feel will last me a lifetime, rather than just this kind of church shopping mentality for another worship experience, and then, you know, getting sick of the pastor, you move on, or you've heard all his teaching. The liturgy of the ancient church is very rich, it's very profound, Most of it is made up from the Psalms and other passages of Scripture. It's not your kind of free-for-all of make-it-up-as-you-go-along worship. On the other hand, there's a lot of a very heartfelt prayer and so forth, and I just feel far more comfortable, far closer to the Lord, and far more in a position to do a little personal growing in that somewhat quieter, more liturgic, less excited atmosphere. And it's a personal choice, and essentially not that far-fetched or unusual. And I just remind people who wonder, well, how's the son of Francis Schaeffer do this? That, my father's last book was called The Great Evangelical Disaster, and it was written with great feeling that all was not well within Protestantism. And, in a way, I look back to his critique of Protestantism, and in a sense, I look at my own life as just having, in some way concluded or moved further in a journey that he was clearly on. He certainly was not in the middle of the evangelical establishment. And, what's so ironic to me is now after he's been dead, of course, the evangelical establishment like to claim him as one of their own. When he was alive and living in Switzerland, he was at best ignored and often vilified as being, too eccentric, too interested in the arts. He had hippies coming to L'Abri, people sleeping on the floor. His doctrine wasn't pure enough. They had art festivals at L'Abri where they showed R-rated movies, and, he constantly drew the criticism of the kind of evangelical mainstream establishment. Now he's safely buried. All of a sudden he's their hero. But I happen to remember, my dad pacing around, lying awake at night, fuming, praying, and being very unhappy about the way he was viewed by so many other Christians at that time. So from my background, anybody who really knew Dad would not at all be surprised I wound up as Orthodox.
Well, you have some things in the book, and it is full of these little nuggets all along the way of anyone who has been on the kind of spiritual pilgrimage you've been on, and I've been on, and I think a lot of us who are more honest about where we have been, where we are, and where we're going. Just little things here and there. One of the things that caught me is a little situation where Calvin notes something that I have noted through the years, and that is that all too many people, when they pray, pretend to be talking to God, when in reality they are merely using the context of that prayer to give some imprint of divine authority to what they're saying. Is, in effect, they're talking to another person. And little Calvin wonders, he says, is it right to preach to someone through your prayers when you're pretending to pray to God, but you're really using your prayers to preach? And even his father agrees with him at that point. This is very symptomatic, it seems to me, of the way that we in the evangelical community tend to seize every opportunity we can for evangelism, and sometimes doing it very unfairly and putting people in uncomfortable positions. And I myself sometimes have heard preachers pray, and I've just wanted to stand up and scream, would you shut up? If you're going to talk to God, but don't use the pretext of talking to God as a way of intimidating me by wanting to really say something to me, but putting it in the context as if God were saying it.
Yeah, well, maybe this is why the historic church, going back to an earlier point about orthodoxy, always used the Psalms as prayers, because with the Psalms of David, his 150 Psalms, you did not have the opportunity to use your prayers as a lecture form or as a browbeating form, the way the mother in Portofino does. But, the problem is when pietism seeks to dress up all of life as spiritual, or to put it another way, when we introduce this hierarchy of values where somehow Bible school and preaching comes ahead of motherhood and painting a picture, then everybody's always seeking to dress up everything they do as spiritual. And in a weird way, they even over-spiritualize prayers in the sense you're talking about. In other words, prayer cannot just be an expression of love for God, worship, expressing our fears and doubts and hopes, and coming before the throne of God with other human beings in worship of Him. It now is a weapon to evangelize, argue with people, change lives, and so forth, much as you see so many fundamentalist Christians have memorized so many Bible verses out of context, seem to understand very few of them in terms of their meaning, but boy, they're ready to haul them out and use them to club you over the head in an argument, and if you memorize one less verse than they did in trading what apparently are contradictory Bible verses, which of course are not at all contradictory, but are when you take them out of context, you lose the argument. Well, similarly in Portofino, the mother doesn't use prayer to worship God. The mother uses prayer, A, to fight with her husband. She prays for her husband, Ralph, that the Lord will change him and touch him and basically make her as good as she thinks she is, although she doesn't put it that bluntly, but that's the point. What she won't say to his face, she'll say in a prayer, and she also uses prayer as a witnessing tool. if you look at the historic church, prayer has always been a form of worship and adoration, first of all in the repetition of the Psalms and other written prayers. It's never been this kind of personalized means of warfare carried on by other means or witnessing by other means. It's first of all worship. So I guess, you've seen people do that. I have too. And so, what the mother does in Portofino, I'm afraid, is I suppose, too typical of what we've done sometimes.
You are, decide another instance you're really going to get yourself into trouble on with the evangelical Christian community there's an instance where little Calvin meets little Jennifer, and he has this sexual and emotional awakening. And then he walks straight into a Roman Catholic church, kneels down in front of Mary, and says, "Hail Mary, full of grace, thank you for the idea on how to meet Jennifer," buys a candle, lights it, crosses himself. You're really asking for trouble on that one, and you know that. So
I'm sure I am.
So what is the point? What is it you're trying to get across here that you're willing to risk that wrath? I mean, you're risking a lot if from the traditional evangelical community.
Sure. Well, the first thing I'm trying to get across is that in the context of the story, that if you drive somebody away from spirituality in their family, they're going to find it wherever they can get it. In a way, this is less a comment on Roman Catholicism as it is on the process of parents turning off their children so badly with all their pietism and their rule keeping.
But Frank,
in the end, the kids
excuse me, Frank,
off and do something else.
Frank, you really don't think that the majority of people in the evangelical community are going to be either A, intelligent enough, B, honest enough, or C, literate enough to conclude that? Aren't they going to see what they think is the obvious and attack you for it?
Well, they may well, but then on the other hand, I don't suppose you do what you do on the radio or write the books you write to simply try to find the lowest common denominator or the most number of people who are applauding you all the time. And I don't write books either for that. I write the books, as C.S. Lewis once said, he wrote the books that he would have liked to have read as a child. Well, I've written a book that I would actually enjoy reading because it mirrors some of my own experiences. And one of those has been a formative experience that you might say I learned the lesson sitting out on sidewalks, sometimes picketing in front of an abortion clinic. The guy next to me saying the rosary and crossing himself, it was real tough to look at him and say, this guy's damned and going to hell forever, sitting out here in the hot sun trying to save a human life along with me and take a stand on these issues and sitting down and praying real prayers of worship, not simply using this as a weapon to evangelize. And I think when one actually works with or knows or loves either Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox or various different Christian denominations that you might not share all their views, say from my point of view as an Orthodox now, it's real tough to start reading people out of the kingdom of God on the basis of whether they're in your church or denomination or not. And, one I suppose is cast back on the idea that somehow maybe Christ will be the judge of these things and that it's not our business. And I guess that in Portofino, I have him wander into this Roman Catholic Church and find a mystical level of spiritual experience that he just hasn't found in his own family. And, if his family wanted him to find some true spirituality there, they could have worked a little harder to make their home more welcoming, more open, more honest, more loving than they did. And, however people take it, again, I think that mirrors something of my own life. It certainly mirrors something of the lives of a lot of people I know who have found solace and grace in a more mystical, liturgical, formal approach to Christianity than just this kind of subjective free-for-all we call worship a lot of the time. But also, in Calvin Becker's case, I say again, if you look at the story, there's no way to read it from my point of view, and of course you can only write for yourself, that doesn't show that he was driven very much out of the Protestant fold by just simply the harshness that he feels.
At the end of the book, or toward the end of the book, you have little Calvin eventually reaching a breaking point. I mean, he finally says enough is enough, and he turns to his sister and says, I hate this family. I hate Mom's talks about our bodies. I don't like the way the family is changing. I hate being missionaries. I hate Dad's church services. He finally lets the phlegm out of his system, and he lets go of it. Are you saying that there is a breaking point beyond which some Christians come and they finally have just enough, and they're ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're ready to cast caution to the wind. And in this, as you pointed out earlier, Calvin eventually doesn't become rebellious. He eventually doesn't really totally throw caution to the wind. But are you saying that there is this breaking point of anger where if people are put in a repressive atmosphere long enough, they can hate?
Well, let's put it this way. If you look at Henry Luce, who started Time magazine, who was probably one of the bitterest enemies of Christianity in this century and didn't mind who knew that, his background was the China Inland Mission. At 18 months, he was shipped off to a mission school so his parents could do God's work, and he was dumped in favor of the Lord's work. And at about 6 years of age, when he asked one of the teachers, why he never got to see his mother or father, why nobody ever sent him any gifts, she said it was God's will, and that they were doing the Lord's work, and that's why he didn't have parents. And, I had people in my own family. My aunt was sent to a mission school in China during that era. And, when you look around at the experiences some people have with Christianity, whether it's pastors' kids who are dumped because their father's too busy doing God's work, or their mother's too busy teaching the Sunday and the Wednesday Bible class and quote-unquote fellowshipping with everybody in the neighborhood except taking care of her children, there are a lot of people out there who reach a breaking point. And the fact of the matter is, rather than pretending this doesn't happen, I think Christians would be better served to face squarely the fact that if they're using Christian work or anything like that as an excuse as to why they're unable to take care of their kids and show them a little love and decency, that it will come back to haunt them. It's a real prescription for losing one's children's trust, but also for, in a way, smashing the image of God in that child's mind, because God becomes the source of blame for the fact that your parents are not doing their parenting very well. And in the case of Calvin Becker, as you say, in Portofino, he never gets to the point where he tosses the whole thing over, but he's certainly not a happy camper. And he isn't the first Christian to come to the conclusion that he hates the whole thing and is ready to throw up his hands. And I think, if we're honest with ourselves, certainly tell you the truth about myself, I've been there many times. I've looked at my own Christian life and despaired of it. I've been in hard times in both the film industry and trying to make it as a freelance writer or the son of Francis Schaeffer, you name it, where I've said, hey, I'm going to bag this whole thing. Then something happens, we come back, we rethink, we grow a little more, we learn something from it. But the fact of the matter is, most of us who have had any kind of Christian life or experience in it know that sense of rising desperation, and little Calvin Becker in the story Portofino just gets to the breaking point.
In my own novel, Dead Air, I committed two sins in the eyes of many people. One, I have a character in there, a kind of Christ figure, who is a black minister, who, in the middle of the book, and I'll give away the story for the people who haven't read it yet, he's killed by a satanic cult.
Right.
I was vilified. How in the world I could let this Christ figure get slaughtered by a satanic cult and allow evil to, at that point, apparently triumph over good was just unthinkable to people. Then I made an even worse mistake. There is a rather violent, dramatic ending to the book, but nobody gets saved. Nobody comes forward, and you are left in this position of good triumphing over evil. That is very obvious, but there is nothing specifically redemptive articulated in the kind of very specific sense that we seem to want. And I know what I ran into, and I know what you're going to run into, because your book ends on this note of ambiguity. Why is it, and we only have just a couple of minutes left, why is it that Christians seem to want everything nice, neatly tied up, the beautiful bow, and in the end, redemptively speaking, we are happy that our side is won. All the basic conflicts have been resolved. We want it to be not just happily ever after, happily eternally ever after.
Yeah.
Why must we always want it to end that way? Is there some secret yearning where we don't want to deal with reality?
Well, I think it's a misplaced vision of where our final hope really is. You know, what we all want to do is really skip the chase and get to the end and be in heaven. But meanwhile, here on earth, where rust and moth corrupt and people break in and steal, and folks like Jeremiah get thrown in pits, and Adam is tempted, and David commits adultery, and the rest of us have our problems, and Christ described the spiritual journey as a difficult path, not an easy path, and the way is narrow, and the chief emotion of Christianity to be hungering and thirsting after righteousness because you never quite get there. Meanwhile, down here on planet Earth, we all have our lives to live and work to do and our job cut out for us. And I think this kind of millennial wanting to just sit on a hill and wait for Jesus to come back, or happy endings tied up in a bow, is precisely the kind of unreality that has cut us off from any kind of ability in dealing with people or the world around us, and is precisely why we're not represented in the arts and the media and film today. And what's so curious is, the same people who will wring their hands and ask for happy endings from your book, Dead Air, or say my book, Portofino, are the very same people who will then turn around and bewail the fact that so few Christians are involved in the arts and that we seem to have nothing to say to the world. Well, if we're not willing to tell the truth, if we all want happy, sugar-coated endings, if we wrap the knuckles of anybody who writes a novel or makes a movie and begin to criticize their theology or say it's not spiritual enough or doesn't have a happy enough ending or everybody doesn't get saved, well, this is not the climate in which people will take the risks, do the experimenting, go out on a limb, and produce books of any value. If you just want Disney-esque entertainment, then, for goodness sake, rent Bambi and let that be an end of it. Not that there's anything wrong with that. But if you want people to write real books or movies or plays, then we're going to have to give people the freedom to do so, to do their experimenting, to do things that we wouldn't quite do the same way, and stop being such, hand-wringing Pharisees about it all.
The book is called Portofino. It's by Frank Schaeffer. It is published by Macmillan, and I recommend it. It's going to shake you up a little bit, and it may not fit into some of your comfortable, confined thinking, but I guarantee you it will challenge you. You'll get a chuckle out of it, and when you read it, you're going to find a lot of things that you're going to have to admit to yourself you have thought and wondered about, but maybe just didn't have the guts to deal with. And you're going to say, man, this guy put in print what I was really thinking all along at that point in my life. And Frank, I thank you for taking time and telling us a little bit more about it. I wish you well with the book.
It's been a pleasure, Bob. Thank you.
This is the end of the message. For further information regarding other topics available on cassette and in printed form, write Compassion Connection, Box 36C, Denver, Colorado, 80236.